Hello and welcome to Debugging and Monitoring, where we will discuss how to troubleshoot your OutSystems application. Now, every time that you write code, you know that code is subject to many errors. You can have logical errors whereby you actually write the code wrong and it doesn't do what you intended to do. For example, you might have an if statement that you want to take the true path given a certain condition, but the code is actually written to take the false path. Or you can have some logic that computes something using a variable which is not the one where you store the values for that computation. Furthermore, there can be data errors whereby the code itself is actually correct, but you use data that's inappropriate for the computation. For example, you might divide by 0, or you might insert a duplicate identifier in the database. Furthermore, there are other assorted problems like performance, security, and connectivity issues that also hinder the behavior of an application. Troubleshooting is the process of going through, of finding these errors and addressing them. And normally it boils down to the process of debugging and monitoring the life of an application. So what is debugging? Debugging is the process of finding with the intention of resolving the effects that are preventing the correct operation of a piece of software. In practical terms, debugging normally involves stopping the code execution at a certain point that you suspect is giving you problems and then stepping through the individual statements of the code, all the time analyzing what the data context is, what the variables hold. Once you look into the statement or the set of statements or the logic that's got problems, you can then finally fix your code. Debugging in Service Studio in the OutSystems platform is very simple. You can place breakpoints on any element that generates code. And you can visually see that by a small marker next to the node that's got the breakpoint. Now by default, every time that you're running your code, the debugger isn't enabled. For the debugger to be enabled, you need to start the debugger so it's monitoring the execution, it's looking out for the breakpoints that you've placed. At any time, at the very bottom of your Service Studio, you have the debugger panel. And over there you can see what breakpoints you have in your current module and you can navigate to them. On the right-hand side of the debugger panel, you have several buttons that allow you to carry out the several debugger-related actions. Things like stepping into, stepping out, and breaking on errors. Now when the code is stopped, you can look at the value of the variables. And you have several sub-tabs in the debugger area. In the In Use tab, you can see all of the statements, all of the variables that are involved in the current statement and actually the outputs of the previous statement. In the locals, you can see all of the variables and all of the outputs that are local to the current context. Next, in the Widgets tab, you can see all of the values of the runtime properties of every widget on your screen. On the Session and Site tabs, you can see the values for a few global kinds of variables that will be covered in a later lesson. Finally, on the watches, you get to pick which variables appear there. So the most interesting ones that you're focusing all your debugging in, you can right-click on them in any of the other panels and say Add to Watches, and they will always appear on watches. Now, when you're debugging a module in Service Studio, by default, it debugs, it stops the execution on the current module that you're debugging. Sometimes this might not be what you want. For example, if you want to debug a producer as it's running within the context of a consumer, you need to specify that the entry module should be a different one, so that the debugger latches on to the version of the current module as it's running within the context of the entry module. There's actually another nuance to debugging an OutSystems application. By default, you debug the application in what's called the public area of the application. And this is where the official location of the application is in the server. So for example, if you have an application called My App, you normally go to your server/myapp. This is the public area of your module, and this is the default place whereby you debug. The OutSystems platform actually allows you to debug on what is called a personal area as well. This is a side copy per user that you can use to try out your changes with little impact on the public area, on the main area of the application. Using the personal area then therefore has this lower impact, but furthermore the act of selecting to run and debug in the personal area is normally a much faster operation. It is worth noting, however, that changes to the data model, if you make changes to the data model, you will need first to republish into the public area prior to running and debugging in the personal area. This is obvious because the database is a shared resource, so you cannot have a local copy of the database for your personal area, just a local copy of the code in your personal area. Now, if you have done any programming in modern languages, you already know about exceptions. Whenever a code operation fails, an exception is thrown, and the same thing happens in an OutSystems application. When this happens, the code execution, the normal code execution, is interrupted and it's moved to an alternate flow, that is, the error handler. In any context, in any action, you can actually have several error handlers, depending on the nature of the error that you want to catch. So you can have database exceptions, security exceptions, or even custom exceptions that you explicitly throw. So when an exception is thrown, the execution is moved to the handler that is most specific to the exception thrown. If no adequate error handler exists in the current code, the runtime will try to find a suitable handler in wherever the context that called the current one. It will bubble up the exception. Let's look at a practical example. In this particular case, the debugger is stopped before a DB operation. We want to update a movie, and we press step over with the intent of carrying on. However, there was a database exception. We actually have two exception handlers, one for database and one for all exceptions. But since the exception was the database exception, we will catch it with the most specific one. So the code execution moves to the database exception handler. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, when an exception occurs, the details of this exception can be obtained from the output of the exception handler node. Let's look in detail into a couple of properties of the exception handler node. One of them is the abort transaction. It dictates if all the database changes, the writes and the deletes that you might have done during this request should be rolled back or not. The default is yes, but if you set it to no, then the previous changes that you made to the database will still be maintained and committed at the end of the current request. The second property is the log error property. This states if this error should end up in the error log of the platform. The default again is yes, but if you set it to no, this will not be logged. Let's talk now a little bit about monitoring. The OutSystems platform provides a complete set of logs that record all sorts of occurrences that happen at runtime. Now, logged events are not limited just to errors, but also can include normal situations for which the diagnostics might be interesting. Say, for example, the duration of screen calls or the duration of web service calls. Monitoring is the act of analyzing and correlating these logs to find out either errors that have occurred or patterns, maybe performance patterns, that might need a change in the code for optimal execution. If you go into the OutSystems Environment Management Console, also known as Service Center, you will see that many kinds of logs are available. You have the obvious errors, general audits, screen accesses and the times that they take, integration and extension calls, timer calls, and many other things. It is possible, as you can see over here, to filter for specific modules, to filter for specific application, time windows, etc. And you can also export the report to Excel. If you notice the rightmost column, the detail, you will be able to get details on the particular event by clicking on that. And you have a wealth of information here that, for example, in the case of errors, will help you greatly find out what might be the problem and how to address it. The two most important fields over here is the message and the stack. The message is very handy because, for example, if it is a SQL error, you probably can look for this string in non-OutSystems discussion boards. And the stack, if you pay close attention to what's there, you'll be able to see what is the calling stack that led to the error, and therefore find this in your module. And this is it for debugging and monitoring. Hopefully this information will come in handy when you're having problems with your application. Bye for now.